Naomi Jefferson had always believed in the undeniable power of hard work. Growing up in a predominantly black neighborhood, she had seen, up close and personal, the countless barriers that stood in the way of people like her. But Naomi? She had always been determined to rise above them, to push through every obstacle thrown her way. From a young age, she had understood that the world often refused to see black women as equals. But her parents, who instilled in her the values of education and self-reliance, had always made one thing clear: never, ever let that stop you. And she never did. She took immense pride in the resilience she had built over the years, in the lessons she was passing down to her son, Malik. Her life? It was living proof that perseverance led to success. Naomi had worked tirelessly, first earning a bachelor's degree in computer science before making her way through the grueling challenges of medical school. Every late-night study session, every exhausting shift, every moment of doubt, she had pushed through it all.
And, in the end,
she had become a successful pediatrician. Alongside her husband, Daniel, a brilliant software engineer, they had built a stable, comfortable life together. After years of navigating the fast-paced chaos of city life, they finally made a big decision. It was time for a change. They longed for a quieter, more peaceful environment, a place where Malik, now 16 and at a crucial stage in his life, could grow and thrive without distractions. The answer? A move to the suburbs, to a neighborhood that promised security, serenity, and a future filled with opportunity. Their new home was beautiful, sitting at the very end of a picturesque tree-lined street. Everything about it felt like a symbol of progress, a testament to how far they had come. Naomi had always seen herself as someone who could bridge gaps between different worlds. She was a successful, well-spoken professional, an achiever. Surely, her family's accomplishments would speak for themselves, right? They weren't just anybody moving in. They were the Jeffersons, a family that had earned the right to live wherever they pleased, just like everyone else. But from the moment they stepped into their new home, Naomi felt it, that strange, almost invisible tension hanging in the air. At first, she brushed it off. Those odd glances from neighbors? The subtle pauses in conversation when she walked by? She had been taught long ago not to take every look or comment to heart. Sometimes, people just need time, she reminded herself. Maybe the families on this street had lived here for years, surrounded by people who looked just like them. Maybe her family's presence was simply something new to adjust to. Still, the unease never really faded. It didn't disappear over time. Instead, it lurked beneath the surface like an ever-present hum, quiet but impossible to ignore. Naomi loved her morning walks. It was her moment of peace, a chance to clear her mind, breathe in the fresh air, and enjoy the calm of suburban life. Rocky, her loyal golden retriever, trotted happily beside her as she strolled past the immaculate lawns and pristine houses. But time and time again, she noticed it, those lingering stares. A hesitation in a neighbor's wave. A hushed conversation that came to an abrupt stop the moment she passed by. Then came the moment that truly unsettled her. One morning, as she walked past a small group of white neighbors chatting in a driveway, their conversation suddenly fell silent. It was immediate, noticeable, not the kind of silence that signals polite respect.
No.
This was something else. This was hesitation, uncertainty, unspoken questions hanging in the air. Naomi felt it in her gut, the way their eyes lingered just a little too long, watching her not with curiosity, but with suspicion. Mrs. Parker, one of the older women in the group, offered a wave, but her smile? It felt off, strained, as if she wasn't sure whether she was supposed to acknowledge Naomi or pretend she wasn't there at all. Naomi nodded back, polite as always, but the unease settled deep in her chest. She knew that feeling, that weight, that quiet but deafening awareness that she was being watched in a way that meant something. She had faced judgment before, of course she had, but she had thought those days were behind her. She had worked so hard, achieved so much. Wasn't she past this? Shouldn't she be past this? Still, she pushed the thoughts aside. It's just a matter of time, she told herself. People would get used to them. Once they got to know her family, they'd see the truth. They weren't any different from anyone else on this block.
Right?
But no matter how many times she told herself that, the discomfort remained. And then, just a few days later, something happened that made Naomi's heart sink. Returning from her morning walk with Rocky, she spotted something that sent a chill down her spine. A police car, slowly rolling to a stop right in front of her house. Her house. Her breath hitched. For a split second, she scanned the street, looking for some sign of trouble, some explanation for why law enforcement had arrived. But deep down, she already knew. The answer came when two officers stepped out of the car and started walking toward her. They weren't aggressive. They weren't hostile. But there was something about their presence, something firm, something authoritative. Naomi's pulse quickened. One officer looked her in the eye. "Do you live here?" he asked. The other officer glanced down at the notepad in his hand. And in that moment she understood. Someone had called the police. On her. Likely, one of her own neighbors. Naomi knew exactly what was happening. Some of her neighbors, the very people who smiled politely at her in passing, had seen her walking through her own neighborhood and decided, without reason, that she was suspicious. Keeping her voice steady and her expression composed, she calmly explained to the officers that, yes, she lived there. This was her home. She handed them her ID, answered their questions without hesitation, and kept her tone professional. But inside, she was burning. She knew the truth. If she were a white woman, standing in the same spot, doing the exact same thing, this entire situation wouldn't be happening. No one would have felt the need to call the police. No officers would be standing in front of her house, subtly questioning her right to exist there. It didn't matter that she was a well-respected doctor, a devoted mother, a loving wife. It didn't matter that she had worked tirelessly to build this life. All that mattered to someone was that she was a black woman in a neighborhood where people like her were still seen as outsiders. The officers, after checking her ID and confirming that she did, in fact, live there, apologized. They offered a few quick, dismissive words about just following up on a call before heading back to their patrol car. But the damage was already done. Naomi stood frozen on her front lawn, her eyes fixed on the spot where the police car had just been parked. Who? She wondered. Which one of them had made that call? A part of her wanted to storm over to each house, knock on every door, and demand an explanation. Who thought she was a threat? Who saw her walking with her dog and felt the need to involve law enforcement? But she didn't. Instead, she turned, walked inside, and shut the door behind her, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. That night, she didn't mention it to Daniel or Malik. She wasn't sure why. Maybe she didn't want to worry them. Maybe she didn't want to admit, even to herself, how much it had hurt. But the next morning, as she walked past the same houses and the same faces, she couldn't help but wonder. Who was it? Was it Mrs. Parker, with her forced politeness and awkward smiles? Or was it someone else, someone watching from behind closed blinds, too cowardly to confront her directly but bold enough to pick up the phone? The uncertainty ate at her. That weekend, Naomi and Daniel decided to do something that should have been simple. Something normal. They planned a small backyard barbecue, a way to celebrate their new home, to enjoy a carefree afternoon with the people they loved. They invited a few close friends from the city, all of whom were black, and set up the grill, a few tables, and some outdoor seating. It was supposed to be a day of joy. And at first, it was. Laughter echoed through the yard as music played in the background. The scent of sizzling burgers and grilled vegetables filled the air. Naomi felt at peace for the first time since they moved in. She loved hosting, making sure everyone had food, sharing stories, and watching Malik joke around with his friends. But then she started noticing. Beyond the fence, across the yard, in the distance, they were being watched. At first, it was just a few neighbors standing on their porches, pretending to be occupied with something else, but clearly paying attention. Then, she caught glimpses of figures behind curtains, peeking through blinds, observing their gathering with something that didn't feel like casual curiosity. It was discomfort. suspicion. And the longer she noticed it, the more obvious it became. This wasn't about curiosity at all. In their eyes, a group of black people simply enjoying an afternoon in the backyard? That was enough to be concerning. They weren't doing anything inappropriate, they weren't being disruptive. They were just existing. But that alone was enough to make some of these neighbors uneasy. Then out of nowhere it happened. A voice, sharp, direct, cut through the air, slicing through the warmth of the afternoon like a knife. "You all are making a lot of noise over there." Naomi turned her head sharply. Mr. Davidson, one of the older men on the block. He stood on his side of the fence, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "This is a quiet neighborhood, not the city." His words hung in the air. Heavy, unmistakable, accusatory. Naomi's first instinct was to glance at the time. 3 o'clock. It was 3 in the afternoon. Not late. Not disruptive. Their music wasn't blasting. Their voices weren't yelling. They were simply laughing, talking, existing. She knew immediately. This wasn't about the noise. This was about who was making the noise. She took a slow breath, keeping her voice composed. "We're just having a small get-together," she said, choosing her words carefully. "But we'll be mindful of the noise." She knew that wasn't what he really wanted. It wasn't the volume. It was them. Their presence. Their visibility. Mr. Davidson didn't look satisfied. He didn't nod or say, "Thank you," or act like her response had been enough. Instead, his expression hardened. His face flushed red, his eyes sharp with something she couldn't quite place, but she knew what it meant. Then he pointed. Not at her. Not at Daniel. At Malik. At her 16-year-old son, who was on the lawn, playing soccer with his friends.